Hi everybody. I thought that we would continue our read aloud, the I've Survived the American Revolution. It's been a while since we read it. It was before spring break, and I figured that we could go ahead and keep going with it. I don't think it'll take too long. We're on chapter 13, and it looks like there's 18 chapters in the whole thing, so we only have about 5 chapters left. Not a whole lot. So I think I'll read maybe 2 chapters today, maybe 3. We'll see. We'll see how long they are, and we'll go from there. I don't know about you, but I don't remember exactly where we left off and what was happening. So our main character is Nate. I remember that much. And then let's see. He met the friend from his dad's boat, I think, and found him in the army. And so that guy asked one of the head army leaders if Nate could have a job, and it was going to be working around camp, I think, right? Let's see. So there's a bunch of soldiers. The British did not attack. So I think, what was it? We remember that the Americans shot the cannons out at the boats in the water, and we weren't hitting the boats. And then the boats in the harbor were shooting towards land, and the cannonballs were hitting the buildings. So the British cannons were stronger than the American cannons. Oh, and remember we looked at all the different soldiers and their uniforms. I'm trying to remember everything that was in here. And I think somebody got sick, right? I just don't remember who that was. James. He was ill, and so Nate's at camp, I think kind of by himself, and then there's somebody in a tent. Okay, and he had hundreds and hundreds of hideous blisters boiled all over his face. It was smallpox, the most dreaded disease of all. So James tells him to go away because he doesn't want Nate to get sick. And then he knew that James was going to die. James did die that night. Oh, and this is where we got talking about chickenpox, because it says he returned with Paul and Martin, who were both safe from smallpox. So I think it was one of those diseases that once you got it, you didn't get it again. Let's see. The sky suddenly turned back. There was a thunderstorm. Oh, I don't remember. Lightning killed 3 men that were running down the street. Nate lay awake all night as the storm raged. He had the feeling that the furious wind was screaming out a warning, and it was. The next morning, word came that the British were on the move. Thousands of British troops had landed on Brooklyn, just across the East River from New York City. The British attack was about to begin. So remember, the boats have been in the harbor for a while, and they've been in camp. There's a bunch of American soldiers kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, and then now the British attack is about to begin. So, chapter 13, August 25th, 1776, 10 a.m., Brooklyn. 3 days later, the Connecticut 5th was ordered to Brooklyn along with 6,000 other soldiers. They were all ferried across the East River on big rowboats. Nate and the men were sent to Fort Greene, one of the 6 Brooklyn forts. All of the forts were spread across Brooklyn Heights. That was the part of Brooklyn that was closest to New York City. Nate hadn't realized how huge Brooklyn was. It had to be at least 10 times the size of New York City, and much of the land was wild. Only a few hundred people lived in Brooklyn, and most had fled. But this wild land was important in the war. If the British took Brooklyn, they would put their cannons on Brooklyn Heights. From there, they could blast New York City to bits. But we're not going to let that happen, Captain Marsh said. It was a few hours after they'd arrived at Fort Greene. Nate and the men had set up their tents inside the fort's tall dirt walls. Now Captain Marsh was explaining the American battle plan. He showed them a map of Brooklyn and pointed out the 6 American forts. Then Captain Marsh pointed to a squiggly line on the map. It looked to be about 1 mile from Brooklyn Heights. That's the Gowanus Heights, he said. It was a long ridge of hills. The British are somewhere on the other side of the ridge, and they have to cross the hills of Gowanus Heights to get to our fort. But we already have 3,000 men guarding those hills. When the British try to cross, Paul chimed in, "We'll blast them right back to England." Captain March cracked a tiny smile, or at least back to Staten Island. The Redcoats and Hessians who made it to the forts would face dozens of cannons. Thousands of Americans would be shooting at them from trenches protected by the tall dirt walls. And so then there's a picture here that shows New York, Brooklyn Heights, the fort, and then the Gowanus Heights. So if they are coming from the Gowanus Heights, they have to go up over those hills to get to the fort. "It will be like Bunker Hill," Samuel said with a hopeful smile. "That's right," Captain Marsh said, the certainty gleaming in his eyes. The men cheered. So what do we remember about what happened at Bunker Hill? So we remember that the Americans were outnumbered. There were more British soldiers than there were American soldiers, but the Americans waited until they could see the whites of their eyes and then fired and ended up winning. Several nights passed and Brooklyn stayed mostly quiet. On the night of August 26th, soldiers from different companies gathered around the campfires. They roasted hunks of pork on sharpened sticks. They insulted the British and called the Hessians foul names Nate would never repeat. The Hessians were hired German soldiers. To Nate, it almost seemed that the men were looking forward to a big party, not a bloody battle. They sang songs, including one that Nate had never heard before. It had a bright and catchy tune, but words that made no sense at all. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony. One man played along on a little twinkling flute called a fife. Paul, Martin, and Samuel all sang along. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. "What's a Yankee Doodle?" Nate asked, raising his voice up over the singing and knee-slapping. "It's what the British call us," Martin said. "They say the Americans are a bunch of Yankee Doodles, country fools who don't know how to fight." Remember, the British soldiers are a trained military and the American soldiers are volunteer fighters. "The British made up this song to tease us in battle," Paul added. "So why are we singing it?" Nate asked. This made no sense at all. "Because at Bunker Hill, we showed them what a bunch of Yankee Doodles can do," Samuel said. "We stole the name and the song." Nate smiled. Now he got it. So basically they're kind of proud of that name now and showed them that it didn't make sense to make fun of them because they were strong enough to beat the British army. The Americans took the British insult and turned it into a battle song. The singing went on until a blaring trumpet called the men to attention. 3 men appeared. The man in the center was very tall and wore a blue uniform. The men leaped to their feet. It was General Washington. The general stood quietly for a moment as the men gathered around him. A hush came over the camp. Even the grumpiest and sleepiest of the men stood up straight. They brushed the dust from their shirts and straightened their caps. Nate stood extra tall. "The moment has come," General Washington began. "The enemy has landed, and now the honor and success of America depends on you." His voice was calm but powerful. He told them that a great battle was coming. He reminded the men what they were fighting for freedom, for their new country. The world will soon learn what a few brave men fighting for their own land can do. His words seemed to rise up into the air, and Nate knew he'd never forget the sound of the general's voice. Most of all, Nate would remember the feeling of being almost lifted up off the ground by nothing more than words. General Washington didn't speak for long, but even hours later, his voice seemed to echo through the camp. After the general left, the men settled down in their tents. Nate quickly fell asleep. Just after dawn, the sound of American alarm cannons boomed through the fort. Paul poked his head into Nate's tent. His eyes were flashing with excitement. The British are trying to cross the Gowanus Heights. The Battle of Brooklyn was about to begin. What do you think? This was only like 3 pages. We'll read more. Chapter 14, August 27th, 9 a.m., Brooklyn, New York. The men of the Connecticut 5th were ordered to help guard the Gowanus Heights. Days before, Captain Marsh had told Nate that he would stay inside the fort for as long as they were in Brooklyn. "You're not a soldier," he'd said. "I don't want you on the battlefield." But that morning, 22 men in the Connecticut 5th were too sick to march. There were not enough men to carry ammunition and other supplies to the ridge. "Nate," the captain said, "I need you to march with us to the camp, and then you'll return here to the fort." They were taking the place of some Pennsylvania soldiers who had been on duty there for 3 days straight. "You'll march back here with the Pennsylvania men." "Yes, sir," Nate said. "Anything happens, we all get ourselves back to the fort. You hear?" "Yes, sir." Gruesome pictures flashed through Nate's mind as he thought of stepping out of the fort. Exploding cannonballs, gut-smashing musket balls, bayonets dripping with blood. But a rush of pride swept Nate's fears away. Captain Marsh was counting on Nate. Paul helped Nate load up a large knapsack with extra ammunition cartridges. He was unusually quiet. He didn't like the idea of Nate leaving the fort. "You follow me," Paul said as they were lining up, "and stay close." Nate nodded. He took a place in line between Paul and Samuel, and then they all set out into the wilds of Brooklyn. They marched along a narrow road under a sunny sky. The road cut through fields and meadows. They passed a deserted farm. The house was boarded up and there was not a person or animal in sight. In the yard was a big tree with a wooden swing hanging from a branch. Nate could imagine Theo shrieking happily as he flew up and down. Who was Theo? The little boy from the beginning of the book. Nate felt the familiar ache of missing Theo. He also thought about the family that had built up that farm. Where had they all gone? Would they ever be able to come back? For the first time, it really hit Nate. This war wasn't just about King George and soldiers on battlefields. Regular people would lose their homes. Others would lose far more, their family members and friends. Sorry. Okay. Even if the Americans won, some people would never be able to get back what they had lost. The road took them up a hill, and soon they were in the woods. They had reached the Gowanus Heights. There were groups of American soldiers standing guard along the way, but not as many as Nate would have expected. They turned off the road and walked along the ridge. The thickening woods made it hard to see more than just a few yards ahead. All was very quiet. And then, boom, boom. 2 sharp cannon blasts shook the ground. Nate froze. Samuel whipped around. "That's strange," he said, his eyes narrowed with worry. "Those cannons were shot from this side of the ridge." Samuel scanned the woods. "The Americans don't have big cannons this far from the forts. The British aren't supposed to be anywhere near here." But they were, and they had the high ground. Crack, 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 crack. Musket fire blasted them from the hill just above. Hiss! A ball streaked right by Nate's ear. Looking up, Nate saw splashes of red between the trees up on the hill. "Redcoats! Take cover!" Captain Marsh shouted. Nate threw himself down into the dirt and covered his head with his hands. More shots exploded. Crack! Hiss! Samuel cried out. Nate peeked up just in time to see him crumple to his knees. Samuel's hands flew up to his chest. Blood gushed from between his fingers. Nate saw it all so clearly, but he couldn't believe it was happening. All he could think was no. No, 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 no. The life drained from Samuel's face. His body seemed to melt to the ground. Nate sprang up and rushed for Samuel, but the redcoats were shooting again. Crack! Hiss! Nate dove back behind the tree. Captain Marsh's voice shouted out orders. "Prepare!" The Connecticut 5th men aimed their muskets. Crack! 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 Then they dropped to their knees and reloaded, exactly as they had practiced in their drills. But this was not a drill. Do you remember how long it took to reload the gun? Nate shook himself out of his shock. Samuel's musket was lying on the ground. He'd spent hours teaching Nate how to use it, and now Nate knew what Samuel would expect him to do. Nate grabbed the musket. The wooden handle was still warm from Samuel's hands. We'll stop there. So what I'm thinking is, do you remember way back at the very beginning, wasn't Nate running through the woods with a gun and there was some guy chasing him with like a bayonet on the end of his musket? So I wonder if we're leading up to that point in time. We only have 2-3 chapters left, but that'll come next time. I miss you guys. I'll see you soon. Bye.